Welcome to this session on exchange rates and monetary policy interventions. In today's discussion, we will explore how exchange rate dynamics and central bank actions shape economic environment in which businesses operate. We begin with the concept of real exchange rate, which captures the relative price of domestic goods against the foreign goods, and this determines a country's price competitiveness in global markets, which directly influence trade flows, export demand, and the cost of imports. So, for businesses, movements in the real exchange rate affect input costs, profit margins, and international market opportunities. So we then turn to the role of central bank in the foreign exchange market. More specifically, how Reserve Bank of India intervenes to stabilize the rupee. So intervention can be taken in two forms. One is called non-sterilized intervention, and the other one is called sterilized intervention. So in this session, we will make a clear distinction between what is meant by non-sterilized intervention and what is meant by sterilized intervention. So understanding these mechanisms is vital because they highlight the trade-off in macroeconomic management. For firms and businesses and investors, central bank actions affect borrowing costs, inflation expectations, capital flows, and ultimately the strategic business management. So by the end of this session, you should be able to connect exchange rate policy and monetary policy interventions with the broader issues in economic environment and business strategy, from investment decision and risk management to long-term competitiveness in global markets. So to begin with, let's talk about the concept called real exchange rate. So the real exchange rate means is actually coming out of the relative prices in domestic and foreign countries. So you know that the demand, normally in the international trade or international relationship, there will be demand for foreign goods and services. At the same time, foreigners will be demanding Indian goods and services, and that we already defined that the demand for foreign goods and services that we call imports, and the demand for foreigners for our goods, that is exports, is influenced mainly by the relative prices. So the proper definition of real exchange rate is that it measures how many units of a foreign country's goods and services can be exchanged for 1 unit of our goods and services. So there is an alternative definition as well. It can also be defined as the nominal exchange rate adjusted for the price differences between countries. So as you already aware that there is price differences between countries, then the consumers, they prefer, obviously they want to buy the same product at a lower prices. So if our goods are relatively expensive, then there will be less foreign demand for our goods. That means our export demand will decline, and not only that, the Indian consumers, they will be demanding foreign goods. That means we will prefer imports. So in this context, the price competitiveness, that is an important parameter to compare across countries. To understand the price competitiveness, we use the real exchange rate as a measure of price competitiveness. So let me begin, give a formal definition what's meant by real exchange rate, how it measures price competitiveness. So as you already mentioned, theta, this one is the price competitiveness. This is E times P star divided by P. Here P star denotes the foreign currency product price in the foreign country. So that means P star is the price of the foreign currency product price that is expressed in foreign currency in the foreign country, and P is the home price level expressed in home currency or domestic currency, and E is the nominal exchange rate measured as the number of home currency units per unit of foreign currency. So in the previous session, we have already defined what's meant by nominal exchange rate. So we have defined it as the number of units of home currency divided by 1 unit of foreign currency. For example, exchange rate is 88 rupees 88 per dollar. That means $1, that is 1 unit, that is 88. This is INR, right? So in this case, you know that this is the number of units of home currency. That means by paying 88 rupees, you are going to get 1 unit of foreign currency. For instance, here 1 unit of $1. So in this case, you know that the exchange rate is 88. What we define here is only the nominal exchange rate. This is not the real exchange rate. What we are going to do that, this E here in the formula also it comes, we are adjusting it for the price differences between both countries, in the domestic country and foreign country. So in order to do that, let me show you an illustrative example. For instance, Marbar exchange, that a price in UK versus Germany. So here we are presenting, first we start with case 1. Here we will list out what is the price of this product in UK. We consider UK as the home country in this example, and what is the price of the same product in the foreign country, for example here Germany. Then we also have the nominal exchange rate. So starting with, to begin with, the price of this bar in the UK is 30 pence, that is 0.3 pound. And the price of the same product in Germany is 0.50 euro in Germany, and the nominal exchange rate, that means we already defined the nominal exchange rate is 0.6. So then applying this formula, you are going to get, that's the same. So you are going to get the real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate times the price of this product in Germany divided by price of this product in UK, that is the home country in our example. So we are getting 1. So 1 here means, I will explain what does it mean. That is in one scenario. So then now let us move to, suppose the price goes up in Germany, it becomes from 0.5 it becomes 0.55 euro in Germany, other things remaining same. Assume that our nominal exchange rate remains same and the price in the domestic country, that is home country, that is in UK, that also remains same, that remains 30 pence. Then applying this formula, now we are going to get the real exchange rate, we get at 1.1. So in this case, what you can make out is that in case 1, when we found 0, that the theta is equal to 1, when the real exchange rate is equal to 1, price are equal across countries, though is expressed in different currency, but at that time we assume that the prices are equal across countries, and because already there is differences in a nominal exchange rate, so this one is equal. So now in this scenario, when we move to case 2, we are getting real exchange rate as 1.1. So that means in this case you can see that UK goods are cheaper relative to Germany. So in this table, what you have done, that we have raised the price of the same product in Germany, in a foreign country. So that means relatively you can see that price in the UK, it becomes cheaper, it declines, it's become cheaper, and at the same time you can see that in Germany, in the foreign country, it become expensive. So that means when it become greater than 1, then that 1.1 means UK real exchange rate has depreciated. So in this case, what happened, that when the price of the same product in UK, it become relatively cheap, and price of this product in Germany become relatively expensive, consumers are now going to demand more of this product from UK, and as a result the demand for pound increases and the demand for euro decreases, and as a result you can say that UK's real exchange rate has, it's actually appreciated, it should be appreciated, UK real exchange rate has appreciated because there is more demand for UK goods and services, so the demand for UK pound has increased and then it appreciate. So in this way what we can see that the price competitiveness of UK good has increased. So the exchange rate, in the exchange rate, what is going to happen that real exchange rate is equal to 1. That means currencies at purchasing power at parity. Currencies are traded at the true purchasing power of goods and services. It is traded at the purchasing power parity. If real exchange rate is greater than 1, goods abroad are more expensive than at home, and when the real exchange rate is less than 1, goods abroad are cheaper than at home. So let me also introduce you another concept called law of one price. Law of one price, in short, we call it as loop. It means that there is one price for the same goods and services in both countries if exchange rate is in the long run, because of the exchange rate is determined by the demand and supply of foreign currencies, and demand and supply of foreign currencies arises because of the demand for exports and the demand for imports. So in the long run, theoretically we can predict that there should be one price for the same product between countries. For example, the mar bar that we have taken here, it should be traded at the same price in both current countries. So in a frictionless world, suppose you ask the question, should the loop hold? Yes, in a frictionless world, yes, it can. But the reason is that if Coke costs $2 in the US and $5 in India, so you know that then you can buy Coke from US and sell it in India, that is arbitrage, and then you can make infinite profit by buying the US and selling in India. But you know that won't happen, because if that is the case, there will be the demand for. That means in order to buy the Coke from US, you will be demanding UK, that US dollar, and as a result Indian exchange rate depreciate. Then over time you can see that this transaction won't hold true, because the exchange rate, there will be depreciation of exchange rate or increase in exchange rate here. So then that means it won't work really. Why loop may not hold? One, actually there are international transportation costs, and that is one, because transporting Coke from US to here, you know that is transportation cost is very high. Then the second one is there is distribution cost, loading, unloading, storage, retail and advertising, and in addition there is domestic cost, and as well as market frictions, and in addition there will be tariff and quotas as well, that will increase the domestic price. So in where the identifying some of the goods where loops work well, that is commodities such as gold, they are homogeneous product, oil, soybeans, wheat, luxury, these are all homogeneous products. In this case there will be law of one price would work, even if you cancel out, neglect this international transportation cost, distribution costs, etc. And similarly in luxury consumer goods also it would work. However, personal services, goods and services like personal services like healthcare, education, restaurant, domestic help, personal care, all these are highly, there is quality differences between among these services between countries. So as a result, the law of one price won't hold true here. And similarly, non-tradable assets like housing, utilities, local transport, in all these cases the loop won't work well. So let's now move to the central government intervention in the Forex market. So before we proceed further, let us remember key points, especially in the context of India. So first of all, the exchange rate regime in India. India follows a managed flow. That means mostly market driven, but that means a flexible exchange rate regime. We are the market driven flexible exchange rate market, but with the RBI intervention very occasionally or very rarely there will be RBI intervention in the Forex market. This happens mainly when there is a volatility in the foreign exchange rate market. So we can see that if there is a trade imbalance, means if imports are greater than exports, assume a scenario that means imports are greater than exports, then obviously you know that the demand for forex rises as compared to the supply of forex. So that is the case because you know that demand for forex is due to the demand for exports. So as a result you can see the rupee depreciate. So what are the likely impact? So one, actually when rupee depreciate, one benefit we have seen that exports become cheap, Indian exports will become cheap abroad, and at the same time our import bills increases, there will be higher import bills, and persistent depreciation may signal weaknesses hurting foreign investors confidence. Assume that initially the foreign exchange rate is 90 rupees per dollar, then it becomes for example 100, then it becomes 110. So what does it mean? That means we are demanding more and more of foreign goods and services. That means that is the reason why we are demanding more forex. So that means persistent depreciation may signal the weakness of the economy. The economic foundation of the economy will be questioned, hurting foreign direct investor confidence. Foreign direct investment as well as portfolio investment will be adversely affected because of persistent depreciation of Indian currency. So in this case, the RBI role is to ensure that there is no persistent depreciation of the Indian currency. So in order to maintain stability by intervening in the forex market, RBI intervene. So in order to do that, how RBI intervenes? So for this, first, suppose it sees that Indian currencies are becoming weak in the foreign market, forex market, then it uses the forex it already has, then it sells the foreign assets. Foreign asset means mainly foreign currency to offset the forex shortage, because what we have seen here is that Indian currency depreciate because the demand for forex increases and the supply of forex decreases. When in order to offset the supply of the decline in supply of forex, the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, sells the foreign currency from its reserve to the forex market, then create the supply generate supply of forex in the market. And in order to do that, because in order to make the forex intervention, over time the Reserve Bank of India accumulates reserves. It buys in good times, it buys foreign assets, financed mainly by issuing currency or other liabilities. So the important thing here is that important policy note that you need to remember that the RBI's interventions are often aimed at smoothing volatility rather than fixing the exchange rate permanently. So the key point is that RBI intervention is not to maintain a fixed exchange rate, but just to smoothing the volatility in the forex rate. So after discussing these points, now we are in a better position to discuss another key aspects in the forex market and policy intervention. So let me introduce a new aspect called impossible trinity. That means a country can achieve only two of the following three goals at the same time. One is called capital mobility. Here perfect is not required. Capital mobility, and second one is fixed exchange rate, and then the independent monetary policy. So these three things, no country can achieve all these three goals simultaneously. So either suppose if it want to achieve capital mobility and fixed exchange rate, then it has to give up independent monetary policy, or if it has to prioritize any of the two, then it has to give up the other one. So a country must choose two and give up one. So just now I discussed here, introduce the term called capital mobility. So capital mobility means it happens mainly because of the integration of financial markets. As you know that bonds and stocks can be treated as across, that these are the two financial instruments. So when there is an integration of financial market across the globe, and that means these financial instruments can be traded across borders with ease. So there is so in some countries between there is perfect capital mobilities. That means investors can move capital internationally quickly in unlimited amounts with a low transaction cost. And it also means that perfect capital mobility means the financial assets in one country is considered in both countries are perfectly substitutable. That means if there is, suppose between India and US, assume that there is perfect capital mobility, then that means if there is a slight change in rate of interest in one country, that would make capital mobility between both countries easily. That there will be free capital movement, finance movement between each country. So for instance, just if I put for example, better example is that the perfect capital mobility, the best example, suppose we take US and Canada, because investors mostly consider that the bonds in US and Canada, they are perfect substitute. So assume that in the US the interest rate is 5%, and in Canada also assume that exchange rate is 5%. If there is perfect capital mobility and if there is an increase in rate of interest to 6% in US, there is 6% in US, then what happened that there will be capital moving from US to Canada easily, immediately and instantly. So that means there is a perfect capital mobility. So it denotes the behavior of asset holders, that the funds flow across countries seeking the highest return or lowest borrowing cost. It can make impact on interest rate because domestic rates cannot deviate much because of if there is a free capital inflow between both countries. So there is a free capital mobility between countries. If there is a slight increase in rate of interest in the Canada, even 5.5%. Suppose if there is a slight increase in Canada, the rate of interest increases, then you know that all the money coming here, that the demand for foreign US bonds decreases. So as a result, its price will decline, and as a result, the rate of interest will increase. The theorem that we studied in one of the previous sessions. So as a result, if rate of interest increases here 5.5% in Canada, then you can also see that in the US also there will be increase in the rate of interest because of the demand and supply in the bond market. So that means there will be the domestic rate cannot deviate much if there is a perfect capital mobility between countries. So let me now introduce key concept related to foreign exchange rate for exchange intervention by central bank. There are mainly two types of intervention. One is called non-sterilized intervention and other one is called sterilized intervention. So in the case of non-sterilized intervention, when central bank intervene, central bank either buys or sells foreign currency, it has impact on the domestic money supply. So let me connect with an example. Suppose RBI buys dollar from Forex market. How it buys? By paying money in return. So when RBI buys dollar from Forex market, it may be through the banking system or the market, and it injects rupees, then as a result you can see that money supply increases in the domestic economy. So that is the non-sterilized intervention. But sterilized intervention is that suppose RBI does it in this way, then you can see that money supply, in this case when RBI buys dollar and injects rupees, then money supply increases. So in the Forex market intervention led to, in this case, money supply increase. So you see, then in order to offset the Forex intervention, because of the Forex intervention, the domestic money supply increase. Now in order to offset this money has to be taken back by the central bank. In order to do that, in order to neutralize the impact on domestic money supply, RBI engage in the open market operation. That means selling, and in this case RBI is selling the government securities to the banking system in the economy and take back the additional money, the increased money supply it takes back. That means by selling the government securities to the banking system, in return central bank gets back the money supply. So in that way RBI here, when RBI buys dollar but simultaneously sells government securities in order to offset the increase in the money supply. So that means the net change in the money supply is neutralized. So in the case of non-sterilized intervention, clearly there is without offsetting action. So there will be changes in the monetary base, as well as it affects money supply and interest rate. But in sterilized intervention, it influences the exchange rate only without changing the monetary base. So the key points to remember, in the case of sterilized intervention, there will be two steps. One is if there is a buying or selling of foreign currency assets, so you know that this is going to affect the monetary base, and the RBI engage with the open market operation in order to make the changes in money supply, in order to offset the changes in the money supply by equal size of open market operation. So this is how it looks like. Suppose there is a depreciation of Indian currency, then you know that in order to reduce the further depreciation, RBI intervene in the market by buying Indian currency. That means selling Forex, and in return buying Indian currency. So as a result, you know that the money supply has declined here. So in order to overcome this, RBI will be buying bond and in return giving the selling money. So money supply remain unchanged. Similarly, if the reason is there is appreciation, then RBI will sell currency and buy dollar. And in order that at that time, you know that there is change in money supply, then in order to offset, open market operation will be in the form of selling bonds, and in return it getting back the money, so that the money supply remain unchanged. So these are the impact of sterilized and non-sterilized intervention on key economic variables, that the impact on money supply and impact on interest rates. Or I have listed the impact systematically in this table. So this is a little bit illustrative example. This I have already explained to you in one of the class, looking at the central bank balance sheet. What are the asset side and what are the liability side. So mainly the liability side, let me repeat, this is bank reserve with the central bank by the banking system, and currency in circulation. So this is the liabilities, and these are all the assets. So what we can see here is that the forex markets and the money markets, they are highly interconnected. The asset sale, that the example that we have already seen here, we can see that if there is the sterilized intervention, they using appropriate policy intervention, RBI neutralize the change in money supply. That is, they are done through the not only once they intervene in the foreign exchange market, they also have to intervene in the money market through open market operation. So the asset sale and purchase by central bank in forex market influences the outcomes in domestic money market if it is targeting inflation by fixing policy rate at a particular level. So let me now explain how a policy intervention, just illustrate clearly how a sterilized intervention would look like. So in this case, assume this is the T account of a central bank. Just see that the asset are this is the assets and these are the liabilities. Now assume that in this scenario, the central bank would like to make a sterilized intervention. Suppose the central bank goes to the forex market and sells $100 worth of foreign bonds for domestic money. So the sale reduces official holdings of foreign assets from 1,000 to 900, causing asset side of the central bank balance sheet to shrink from 2,500 to 2,400. Now you can see that this has declined. And then in this case, the central bank balance sheet after the $100 of foreign asset, it looked like this, because you know that when they are selling $100, because you can see that there is a decline of $100 of asset, and in return they take equivalent money from here, Indian currency in circulation decline from 2,000 to 1,900. It can do from the central, that the general public. It can also do from this change. It also can happen from the banking system as well. The same can be explained through the banking reserve as well, with the banking system, the deposit held by the banking system with the RBI. Suppose the open market operation is done through the banking system. So this would look like this. So in this case, so then what happened that central bank sheet, if they see that there is a decline reserve here. In order to compensate that, what central bank will do, that central bank will buy government securities from the banking system that is worth of 100, and at the same time you can see that in return this banking system will be getting 100 worth of Indian currency as the reserve from the central bank. Because the banking system will be selling $100 of government securities to the central bank. In return, this banking system will be getting $100 worth of Indian currency. So to summarize this, in conclusion, what we have seen here is that the real exchange rate, it shapes the country's global competitiveness, and the central bank intervention, whether sterilized or non-sterilized, it determines how exchange rate adjustments spill over into domestic money supply and interest rates. So for businesses and policy makers alike, these dynamics are crucial as they influence trade flows, capital movements, and the broader economic environment in which strategic decisions are made. Thank you for watching this session, and see you in the next session. Thank you.